Good morning, Bible class. Greetings and salutations to you way out there in internet land. Virtual hug. Hope all is well with you. Appreciate you tuning in and watching this Bible class on your Facebook or however else you can watch it. I'm not sure how many ways you can, but hopefully on Facebook. Hope that you have got your Bibles ready this morning. We're going to be getting into 1 Corinthians chapter 7 today. And so if you want to be opening your Bibles to 1 Corinthians 7, let me just say again, thank you for tuning in and watching this program, and I hope that you receive some kind of blessing from our study of God's Word together. Before we get into chapter 7, just want to do a brief review, as is our custom, of the chapter that we covered last week, and that was chapter 6. Now you'll notice, or you'll remember from our study, that the Corinthians were divided because they were taking each other to court and suing one another for matters that should have been solved among themselves in the church. And this was giving the church a terrible reputation in Corinth. And the message of Paul is trying to get across to the Corinthians is this has got to stop. The reputation of the church is of utmost importance. And we never can underestimate how valuable and important our name is in the community around us, and how our behavior can affect our name and our reputation as individuals, the reputation of the church. Because of this, Paul stresses the importance of moral excellence in the lives of the Christians there and everywhere. Now, if you want to talk about the moral excellence of the congregation at Corinth, just go back to where we were talking about the problem of the young man with his father's wife. Obviously, there was immorality in the church. Paul says we've got to fix this problem because it's doing damage to our reputation. Each Christian plays an important role in how the church is perceived in the community around them, both as a gathering and as an individual. The importance of and value of the church cannot be stressed enough. I hope that you love the church. I love the church more than I can even begin to tell you. Having been raised in religious error and finally coming to a knowledge of the truth, the value of the church is beyond measure. And I hope you feel that way as well. So now we're going to go ahead and go into chapter 7. Now, let me just give you I don't know what they call it on TV, when they give you a warning about the content of the passages of the show that you might be watching. There's some sexual content to chapter 7. And so if you're easily offended by that, I hope that's not the case, but if you are, you might want to just skip this lesson because we've got to talk about some very important and serious things when it comes to physical relationships. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul begins to answer the questions that the Corinthians had sent to him. And first, there is a series of answers to those questions about marriage and or abstinence. So he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband." So, as popular as fornication was, or excuse me, I should say as popular as fornication is in our society, it was much more popular in the Corinthian society. And of course, you have the temple prostitutes and so forth, the practice of their day based solely on that particular pastime. And so, Paul says, Christians are to avoid fornication. And the best way for Christians to avoid fornication, or anybody for that matter, is for a man to have a wife and a woman to have a husband. So that's the context in which everything else in this chapter is discussed. Now, you will find people who build whole doctrines about whole different subjects from the things that are recorded in this chapter, and they forget the context. Okay? So, again, we always have to stick to the context. Remember, Paul is writing to the Corinthians for the express purpose of answering their questions. And that's what he says there in verse 1. And so he's going to do that Apparently, there were some problems with marriage, with fornication, and with other issues along those lines. So, we've already discussed the philosophy that was popular then in Corinth and seems to be quite popular today, and that is the philosophy that says, if it feels good, do it. Paul addressed it this way. Some are saying the belly is for meat and meat is for the belly, so eat all the meat you want to eat. And he was using that to describe the attitude of people toward sexual sins. God has made us sexual creatures. He's made us with this tremendous and wonderful blessing to be able to procreate. And that blessing is to be enjoyed, but is to be enjoyed in the proper context. It's within the bonds of marriage. And so when we go outside of that, then of course fornication takes place, and we have to reach the point where we understand that that's displeasing in God's sight. And of course, if it feels good, do it. Then that outlook on life could very easily lead to promiscuity and unfaithfulness in marriage. So Paul makes it clear that one of the primary functions in marriage is to prevent fornication. In verses 3 to 6, Paul is going to explain that it is the responsibility of both parties in the marriage to meet the sexual needs, the physical sexual needs of the other one in order to prevent fornication. And so he says, starting in verse 3, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power over his own body, but the wife. So Paul is very clearly pointing out that we as husbands and wives have responsibilities toward each other. And unfortunately, there are those who consider this a burden. There are those who consider this a task. There are those who consider this difficult. And I firmly believe that part of that is because we failed to teach the beauty of the sexual relationship in the marriage and what it can do to improve the relationship. So it's pretty clear from what Paul says in this chapter what God's definition of a marriage is. That a man have a wife, that a woman have a husband. Man, wife, woman, husband. It's also clear that both parties in the marriage are equally obligated to fulfill the needs of each other. If you are not willing to meet another person's needs, then marriage is not for you. You join together in the bonds of holy wedlock to become one. And in order to become one, you have to meet each other's needs. Not just the sexual physical part. That's just what Paul's talking about here. But there's so much more involved in that relationship between husband and wife. And again, I think we fail as Christians when we do not teach the importance and beauty of the physical relationship in the marriage and how it is designed to unify the couple in their relationship with God. The one exception, though, to this rule is when both parties agree to abstain from the physical relationship for the purpose of spiritual growth. And that's what Paul's going to talk about next. He says in chapter 5, defraud ye not one another. To defraud means to fail to fulfill your responsibilities. Don't fail to fulfill your responsibilities to one another, except it be with consent for a time. So there's a marked period of time that these responsibilities are going to be set aside by mutual agreement. That you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again. So you have a set period of time. You use that set period of time for fasting and prayer, not as a weapon because I'm mad at my mate, not as a tool to get what I want from my mate other than the physical relationship, but things that I want from my mate or behavior that I want from my mate. But you use that time for fasting and prayer. And then you come together again, that Satan tempts you not for your incontinency. But I speak this by permission and not a commandment. The word incontinency means the lack of self-control. Now, there's two important things to remember here, and they are that God knows that we have sexual weaknesses. Guess what? The second thing is Satan knows we have sexual weaknesses as well. God can use our physical relationship to draw us closer to Him and closer to one another. Satan can use those same desires, those same pleasures, and drive us further away from God. The marriage relationship is designed to help us overcome those sexual weaknesses and glorify God in our marriage. And so we need to be very, very conscious. We need to be very, very aware of this situation and circumstance. Now, Paul says, I say this by permission, not a commandment. He's not commanding that people take time away from their physical relationship with one another for the purpose of fasting and prayer. He's not commanding you to do that. And if you and your mate decide that that's not a good thing for you, that's fine. It's not commanded that you do it. But he is saying, if you do it the right way. By mutual consent, for a time, and then come back together. Now in verses 7 through 9, Paul says that he preferred that people remained unmarried if they could maintain their sexual purity. But if not, it would be best to marry. This is starting at verse 7. For I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But, and there's that little three-letter word again, every time it pops up, he's giving you some more information. It's very important. If they cannot maintain their sexual purity, if they cannot avoid fornication, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn. As a single man, Paul understood the value of living a life unencumbered with concern for family and concern for a maid, concern for children that might be used against him in times of persecution. How difficult would it be if Paul had a maid and he was arrested, and then his mate was arrested, and some Roman emperor said, if you don't deny Christ, we're going to cut her head off. Well, that'd be quite burdensome. I've done a little bit of missionary work in my life, gone to different parts of the world, and I can tell you that being far away from my mate for an extended period of time puts an enormous amount of stress on her. And so that's why when I would go on missionary trips, I would not stay for extended period of time. I'd do short missionary trips and then get back home. Had a wife, had 2 children I needed to raise, and they needed me there too. So I got to fulfill my responsibility and my love for preaching and my love for evangelism and my love for God and Jesus and my love for the lost. I got to fulfill that and then come back and continue to fulfill my responsibilities at home. So Paul also understood that not all people could be faithfully abstinent. Okay? He says some people are geared up this way, some people are not geared up this way. And if you're not geared up this way, get married. Starting in verse 10 now. And unto the married I command, yet not I but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. Let not the husband put away his wife. Okay? So after addressing the single, should I get married? Should I not get married? If you can't practice abstinence, get married. Now he goes to the married couple. After addressing the single, he turns to those who are married with instruction concerning their relationships. If you're married, stay married. If you separate, remain single, or be reconciled. Paul is not giving a second reason for divorce and remarriage. In fact, remarriage is not even discussed. Divorce and remarriage is not even discussed in this chapter at all, although some people would like you to believe that it is. That's not what the context is covering. But again, some have tried to find it being taught here. Paul addresses the question of being married to an unbeliever next. So he's talked to the singles, he's talked to the married, how are they going to deal with the situation? And now he goes and takes it a step further and talks to people who are married to unbelievers. Now, we all know that it was an idolatrous world back then, and some people came out of idolatry, and some people stayed in idolatry. And so the question is now, for those who have come out, should they remain married to their idolatrous mate, even though they have left idolatry? And so this is what Paul's addressing. This is the question that they asked. Verse 12. But the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband, else were your children unclean. But now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. Okay, so if a woman is married to an idolatrous husband and he's satisfied staying there with her, let him stay. If he wants to leave, let him leave. Vice versa. If a man who is a Christian is married to an idolatrous woman, an evil woman, an unbelieving woman, and she's content to stay with him, let her stay. If she wants to leave, let her depart. Okay? Not under bondage. Now, not under bondage has received a lot of attention as we've discussed marriage, divorce, and remarriage in our brotherhood. But remember, Paul is not talking about divorce and remarriage. He's talking about how to deal with this situation of sexual abstinence or getting married. And again, answering the questions of those people there in Corinth. His instruction to those couples is to stay married, and his reasoning for this instruction is found in verse 16. Okay, so why did Paul give this instruction? Why did Paul say, stay if he wants to stay, leave if he wants to leave? For, what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? You're married to an unbeliever. Okay. What are you doing to convert them to Christ? If you kick them out, there's no chance. If you put them away, there's no chance of gaining that person's soul for the cause of Christ. So how many people do you know have gained the salvation of their souls because of the efforts of a godly spouse? I can tell you, in my personal life, that if Sherry had been one who said, I'm not going to have anything to do with him because he's not a believer, I wouldn't be here today. It's because of her godliness, because of her example, because of her love for the Lord that I obey the gospel. Now, again, there are those that get caught up in the... Oh, by the way, I have on here, you probably saw it, I didn't get to it yet. 1 Peter 3 and verse 1 talks about the efforts, or what should be the efforts, of a good Christian woman who's married to a man who's not a believer. So this theme is not just covered by Paul, it's covered by Peter as well. And again, shows our responsibility, whether I be the husband or whether I be the wife, to do everything I can within my ability to gain the salvation of my mate's soul. So, going back again to 1 Corinthians 7:15, the not under bondage. A lot has been said, a lot of people get caught up in that verse. To help us understand Paul's meaning, we have to take into consideration, again, the context that the statement appears. Paul is not just talking about marriage, he's discussing a specific subject, the specific subject of sex in the marriage. And he says that marriage is to avoid fornication. He also already specifically stated that the husband and wife have the God-given responsibility to meet one another's sexual needs. Now, when the marriage vows are broken, either through fornication or through desertion, the unbeliever puts away the believer. The innocent spouse is no longer required to fulfill this responsibility. That physical relationship, when someone departs, stops. That part of the relationship is over until that individual decides to come back and be part of the marriage again. There are those who have believed and practiced that, we were married, so we can continue to participate in fulfilling each other's needs even though we're not married anymore. Because we used to be married, he can just keep coming back, or she can just keep coming back anytime she wants to. But I've seen this in action, and it's not what the Bible teaches. If the mate were required to continue the physical relationship once that individual has departed, again, either because they broke the marriage vows through fornication, or they just decided they couldn't stand to live in a Christian home, whatever the case might be, if they were still required to meet the qualifications, that would qualify as sexual slavery. And God has never intended for the physical relationship between husband and wife, not just the physical relationship, but any part of the relationship between the husband and wife, to be slavery. That's not the goal. And so, not under bondage does not have anything to do with whether or not a person is scripturally qualified to be remarried if they have divorced for any reason. So, continuing his thoughts on marriage, Paul extends his instruction to other parts of life. He says he teaches in verses 17 to 21 that the Corinthians, that there are really no changes that need to be made as long as the Lord's commands are being followed. So the idea is, does my relationship with my mate change once I become a Christian if my mate does not become a Christian? So that's the direction he's headed in this, or the direction the question is headed, and the answer that he's giving. If a man decides to obey the gospel but his wife does not, does that change the marriage relationship? Now, he just said just a few moments ago that you stay together, the marriage is still sanctified, the children are still sanctified, that is pleasing in God's sight because of that believer's faith. But now, he takes it a little bit further. As God hath distributed unto every man, as the Lord hath called everyone, let him walk, and so ordain in all the I can't talk this afternoon. And so ordain I in all churches. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any man called in uncircumcision? Let him not become be circumcised. Okay, now circumcision and uncircumcision would be the way that he's describing the difference between Jew and Gentile. Okay? And so in verse 19 he says, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandment of God. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Jews do not have to become Gentiles. Gentiles do not have to become Jews. Bondservants do not need to seek their freedom. And just as all this is in line with, just as someone who is married does not need to seek divorce, nor do singles need to seek marriage. Wherever you're called, that's who you are in Christ. Now, obviously, there would be some changes that would need to be made as far as behavior is concerned. For example, if a temple prostitute decides to become a Christian, can't participate in that kind of worship anymore. That's got to be brought. You got to be brought out of that. But his point is, particularly in the marriage, if you're married, stay married. If you're single, stay single. If that's how you choose to be. Verse 20. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. Whatever situation you find yourself in, use that situation to glorify God. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. Likewise, also, he that is called being free is Christ's servant. You're bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men, brethren. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called, therein abide with God. His point is that Christians are supposed to serve God with every ounce of their being, no matter where they are called, no matter what their social standing, no matter what position they have in life. They've been bought with the blood of Christ, and therefore, and thereby, they should glorify God. True freedom is not found in a lack of bonds. True freedom is not found in a removal of chains. True freedom is not found in being released from prison. True freedom is found in the service of Jesus Christ. And we're going to have to stop here for this morning because we just don't have time to continue on in our study. But we'll pick up with this verse, Lord willing, next week. I hope you got something you can study on, you can chew on, that'll bless you and benefit you and encourage you. Thank you again for tuning in and watching this Bible class. God bless you, and I love you very much.